They pay a full order book and a confident board of directors. They are, on paper, the greatest commercial success story the American defense industry has ever produced. And they are quietly, systematically, and brilliantly dismantling the American defense industry from the inside. Not with bombs, not with sanctions, not with threats, not with anything that shows up on a military radar screen or gets flagged by an intelligence agency or makes the front page of a newspaper. They are doing it with contracts, with conditions, with a single sentence buried in every deal they sign, a sentence that says, before you get our money, you must first give us your knowledge. Before you sell us your weapons, you must teach us how to build them ourselves. Before you take our billions, you must help us build the industry that will one day make your billions unnecessary. Sign here. We look forward to doing business together. For as long as we still need you. This is the story of how Saudi Arabia turned itself from the world's most dependent arms buyer into one of its fastest rising defense manufacturers, and how, in doing so, it may have already written the beginning of the end for American defense dominance, not in a decade from now, but right now, today, in the contracts being signed in Riyadh, in the factories rising from the Saudi desert, in the thousands of Saudi engineers being trained this year on American systems, at American expense, to do American jobs. To understand what is really happening here, you have to go back to 2016. That is the year a young, ambitious, and ruthlessly calculating crown prince named Mohammed bin Salman unveiled his sweeping plan for Saudi Arabia's future. He called it Vision 2030. On the surface, it looked like a straightforward economic reform program: diversify away from oil, create employment for a young and restless Saudi population, modernize an economy that had been dependent on crude prices since the mid-20th century. And yes, it was genuinely all of those things. But buried inside Vision 2030 was a military-industrial strategy, so ambitious, so precisely engineered, and so strategically intelligent that most Western analysts completely missed it when they first read through the document. They saw the tourism numbers. They saw the entertainment investments. They did not see the weapons factory being designed in plain sight. The plan was this: Saudi Arabia would commit to a target. 50% of all its defense spending would be produced domestically by the year 2030, not just bought from a Saudi-owned company. Not merely assembled on Saudi soil with foreign parts, actually produced, manufactured end-to-end, engineered by Saudi minds, built by Saudi workers in Saudi facilities using Saudi-controlled supply chains. This was not just an industrial goal, it was a strategic weapon. Because to reach that goal, Saudi Arabia did not need to develop its own technology from scratch. Over 30 painful years of failure and iteration, it already possessed something far more powerful than engineering talent or institutional patience. It had money. Staggering, almost grotesque amounts of money flowing from its oil fields every single day, and it was going to deploy that money to force the most powerful defense companies in the world to build a Saudi defense industry for it, using their own expertise, their own technology, their own engineers, while Saudi Arabia simply paid the bill and collected the results. Here is the genius of the architecture Saudi Arabia designed, and it deserves close attention because the strategic elegance is genuinely extraordinary. Instead of trying to compete with American defense companies from a position of weakness, it hired them as its own contractors. Instead of attempting to acquire technology through intelligence operations, a path that carries enormous geopolitical risk and often delivers incomplete or poorly documented results, Saudi Arabia bought the legal right to have technology transferred directly, contractually, with American companies themselves doing the work of training, documenting, and setting up Saudi production lines. Instead of building an indigenous arms industry through the kind of long, expensive, and deeply uncertain development process that took the United States and Europe a century to complete, Saudi Arabia wrote a set of contract conditions that obligated the world's most sophisticated weapons manufacturers to physically come to Saudi Arabia, build factories on Saudi ground, hire and train Saudi workers using Saudi government investment, transfer the sensitive production knowledge that had taken decades to develop, and then keep showing up, because the next multi-billion-dollar contract required them to do all of it again at an even deeper level. The entire transformation was financed by the same enormous defense budget that Saudi Arabia had always used to simply buy foreign weapons. The only thing that changed was the terms. The customer rewrote the contract, and the suppliers had no choice but to sign. Here's how the mechanism was constructed to make this happen at scale. Saudi Arabia created a government body called GAMI, the General Authority for Military Industries. GAMI became the single, non-negotiable gatekeeper for every defense contract in the kingdom. Nothing gets sold to the Saudi military without GAMI's explicit approval. No aircraft, no missile system, no radar array, no armored vehicle. No satellite communication system. No software platform that touches a Saudi military network. Nothing. GAMI controls the full procurement pipeline for the Saudi Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Interior, and every other government body that spends money on military hardware or services. Every major American defense company that wants access to one of the wealthiest and most consistent military markets on the planet must go through GAMI's process, meet GAMI's requirements, and agree to GAMI's terms. And GAMI attached to every contract, a condition that had no meaningful equivalent anywhere in the previous history of the global arms trade. They called it the Industrial Participation Program. The Industrial Participation Program says this, and it is worth reading slowly to understand what it actually demands. If you want to sell weapons to Saudi Arabia, you must also invest in Saudi Arabia's ability to manufacture those weapons itself. You must transfer technology, real technology, working technology, the kind that actually produces results, not outdated systems that are already obsolete. You must bring genuine manufacturing capability into the kingdom. You must train Saudi engineers and Saudi technicians on systems they will operate, maintain, and one day build. You must create joint ventures with Saudi companies and give those companies meaningful exposure to your most valuable production processes. You must contribute to local research and development initiatives. You must help develop Saudi supply chains that route spending through Saudi businesses, rather than American ones. You must bring subcontracting work to Saudi firms. And every single one of these conditions must be agreed to up front, in the contract, before a single rial changes hands. You cannot defer them to a future date. You cannot satisfy them with nominal gestures. You cannot pay an offset fee and walk away having technically complied. You must deliver real industrial capability, and you must do so as a condition of every major contract you win. The United States government warned American companies about exactly this. The U.S. State Department's official country commercial guide for Saudi Arabia, a document the U.S. government publishes to help its own companies navigate foreign markets, explicitly describes these new localization requirements using the word onerous, not challenging, not demanding, onerous. And yet, because the contracts are measured in tens of billions, because the relationship generates revenue that American defense companies cannot replace anywhere else in the world, because Saudi Arabia is the single largest buyer of American weapons on Earth by a significant margin, every major U.S. defense company agreed. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, they all signed. Because the alternative to agreeing was watching a European competitor agree instead and losing the business entirely. The trap was perfect. The price of entry was the thing that made entry worth wanting. So what has Saudi Arabia actually taken through these agreements so far? What has moved from American hands to Saudi hands? The answer is more advanced and more strategically significant than most outside observers have acknowledged. Start with THAAD, the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System. This is one of the most sophisticated and most tightly guarded missile defense systems ever developed. Lockheed Martin built it over decades of concentrated engineering effort. It represents the pinnacle of American missile intercept technology. It deploys sensors, tracking systems, and kill vehicles that operate at altitudes and speeds that make it unlike almost anything else in the world. It is not the kind of technology that transfers easily or safely. Governments argue for years about whether it should be shared even with close allies. And in May of 2025, Saudi Arabia manufactured its first THAAD components on Saudi soil, in Saudi facilities, operated by Saudi workers, directly facilitated by Lockheed Martin. Not assembled from American-made parts, manufactured, produced. The company that built this system over generations of engineering investment helped Saudi Arabia stand up the production capability to make pieces of it inside the kingdom. Then consider the Patriot air defense system and what Raytheon agreed to in 2024. Raytheon, operating under the RTX Corporation name, formalized a strategic alliance under which it would support the production, assembly, and testing of Patriot system components inside Saudi Arabia. It agreed to train Saudi personnel not just to operate the Patriot, but to maintain it, repair it, and manage its technical life cycle. The Patriot is not an obscure system. It is deployed across Europe, across Asia, and across the Middle East. It is the frontline air defense platform for America's most critical alliances. Its technical details are among the most protected in the American defense inventory, and Raytheon agreed to build Saudi Arabia's capability to work on it, because that was the cost of the contract. The contract was worth billions. Then there is what SAMI has become, and what it represents about how far Saudi Arabia has already traveled on this road. Saudi Arabian Military Industries was launched in 2017 with an ambitious mandate, but essentially no industrial base. 8 years later, it ranks 75th among the largest defense companies on Earth, according to Defense News. It entered the global top 100 for the first time in 2022. It climbed 19 places in a single year between 2022 and 2023. It is one of the fastest growing defense companies on the planet. And it achieved this not through organic invention, but through systematic absorption, Joint ventures with Boeing subsidiaries, partnerships with Raytheon divisions, collaboration with BAE Systems, technology sharing across dozens of agreements with Western and Asian defense contractors. SAMI acquired a former Boeing offset company. It acquired the Advanced Electronics Company, which observers have called the most technologically rich asset in Saudi Arabia's defense ecosystem. It is building a national defense champion at a pace that was considered impossible a decade ago. Boeing occupies a particularly exposed position inside this dynamic, and it is worth examining separately because Boeing's situation illustrates how the Saudi strategy can exploit existing corporate weakness with devastating efficiency. Boeing's commercial aviation division has spent the last several years in genuine crisis. The 737 MAX disasters, followed by a cascade of quality control failures that became very public, followed by financial losses that alarmed an industry long accustomed to Boeing's stability. All of this has made Boeing's defense division more critical to the company's overall survival than at almost any previous point in its history. Boeing needs Saudi contracts. It needs them in a way that makes saying no to Saudi conditions practically impossible. Saudi Arabia knows this. And so the offset requirements, the localization demands, the technology transfer obligations that apply to Boeing's contracts in the kingdom are not negotiated from a position where Boeing has real leverage. They are accepted because refusing means losing business that Boeing's current financial position cannot afford to lose. Saudi Arabia is building an aerospace maintenance and overhaul industry inside its borders, with BAE Systems Arabian Industries now operating as a merged local entity that absorbs work Boeing would previously have done from American facilities. Every capability that Saudi Arabia internalizes through these arrangements is future Boeing revenue that will not materialize. And Boeing, uniquely vulnerable in this moment of its history, signed all of the agreements that made it possible. Now consider the structural financial reality underneath all of this activity. Saudi Arabia's defense budget has grown at an average compound annual rate of 4.5% since 1960. In 2024, it reached approximately $80 billion by the most widely cited estimates, making Saudi Arabia the fifth largest military spender on earth. The 2025 allocation is $78 billion, 21% of total government spending and more than 7% of GDP. Saudi Arabia's defense acquisition budget alone, meaning the portion dedicated to actually buying and building new systems rather than operating existing ones, was estimated at nearly $20 billion in 2024 and is projected to reach almost $27 billion by 2029. Between 2020 and 2024, 74% of Saudi Arabia's imported weapons came from American companies. Saudi Arabia alone accounted for 12% of all U.S. arms exports globally during that period. It is, without serious contest, the most important single foreign customer the American defense industry has. The revenue it generates funds production lines. It funds research and development. It funds the industrial capacity that keeps America competitive in defense technology. In specific programs and for specific companies, the Saudi relationship is not just commercially significant. It is the margin between a program that continues and a program that gets canceled. There is a geopolitical dimension running through all of this that makes the picture even more complex than a simple business story, and it needs to be understood because it changes the stakes entirely. Saudi Arabia is building this defense industrial capability at exactly the moment when the United States is most distracted by competing priorities: the pivot to Asia, the management of the Russia-Ukraine war, the recalibration of Middle East commitments, the domestic political battles over foreign policy. America's attention is divided in ways it has not been for decades. Saudi Arabia is fully focused. Every year that American attention is directed elsewhere is a year in which Saudi Arabia's factories produce more, its engineers learn more, and its industrial base deepens without serious external scrutiny or policy pushback. The window in which American policy could have responded to Saudi Arabia, a strategy with countermeasures, stricter technology transfer controls, renegotiated offset terms, alternative industrial frameworks, was the first 5 years after Vision 2030 launched. That window is largely passed. The infrastructure is built. The partnerships are established. The workforce is in training. The momentum is self-sustaining. There's also the China question, which American defense planners regard with quiet alarm. Saudi Arabia has carefully maintained open lines of communication with Beijing throughout its defense transformation. It has not purchased major Chinese weapon systems, primarily because American technology remains superior and because Saudi Arabia wants to keep its relationship with Washington functional. But the existence of the Chinese option, the knowledge that Saudi Arabia could, if sufficiently frustrated with American conditions, begin diversifying its technology base toward Chinese suppliers as well, gives Riyadh leverage that it uses constantly and that American negotiators feel in every conversation. Saudi Arabia does not need to buy Chinese weapons to benefit from China's existence as an alternative. It simply needs American companies to believe it might. And they do believe it, which means every negotiation Saudi Arabia has with an American defense contractor takes place under a ceiling that China has helped set. There's a question that gets asked less often than it should, and it deserves a direct answer. Where is the American policy response to all of this? Where is the coordinated congressional oversight, the executive branch industrial strategy, the coherent government-level response to what Saudi Arabia is systematically and transparently doing? The answer, when you look honestly, is that it barely exists. Congress debates individual arms sales to Saudi Arabia regularly, usually through the lens of human rights. The Yemen war, the Khashoggi murder, the use of American weapons against civilian populations, these are entirely legitimate concerns, and they have produced real consequences, including a ban on offensive weapons sales that lasted from 2021 to 2024. But the structural question, whether the terms on which Saudi Arabia buys American weapons are gradually extracting the core of American defense industrial advantage, almost never enters the debate. American policymakers are focused on the transaction level. Should we sell this weapon to this country right now? Saudi Arabia is focused on the architectural level. How do we use this transaction to build a permanent industrial capability that makes the next transaction less necessary? The two sides are not engaged in the same strategic conversation. America is counting current revenue. Saudi Arabia is counting future factories. But the direction this relationship is moving in is unmistakable and irreversible. In 2018, Saudi Arabia produced 4% of its defense needs domestically. By end of 2024, that figure was 24.89%, essentially 25% in 6 years. The head of GAMI has publicly expressed confidence that 50% will be reached by 2030, and that the kingdom will likely exceed it. Every percentage point of localization that Saudi Arabia gains is a percentage point of foreign defense spending that does not leave the country. At $80 billion per year, each additional percent of localization represents $800 million that stays in Saudi Arabia instead of flowing to foreign companies. From 4% to 50% is a shift of approximately $368 billion of annual purchasing power, not all at once, but accumulated year over the lifetime of the systems being built. There's a human dimension to the knowledge transfer that rarely gets discussed, and it may ultimately be the most durable part of what Saudi Arabia is building. Technology can be reverse engineered. Factories can be built and then fall idle. Supply chains can be disrupted. But human knowledge, the kind of deep technical expertise that an engineer or a manufacturing specialist carries in their mind and their hands, that knowledge does not go away. Saudi Arabia's General Authority for Military Industries launched a National Academy for Military Industries in 2022, capable of training 2,000 students per year in engineering and technical fields directly relevant to defense manufacturing. SAMI has partnerships with international universities. It runs training programs with companies like Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and BAE Systems, where Saudi engineers work alongside American and European engineers on actual defense systems, absorbing the tacit knowledge that never appears in any manual. When Saudi Arabia says it wants 40,000 people working in its defense sector by 2030, it does not just mean 40,000 people operating machines. It means 40,000 people who know how modern weapon systems are designed, built, tested, maintained, and improved. An industrial workforce with that depth of knowledge does not disappear when a contract ends or a political relationship shifts. It stays in the country. It trains the next generation. It becomes the permanent foundation of a defense industry that no longer needs foreign teachers. The sustainment dimension makes all of this even more significant. Defense industry analysts have long understood that the purchase price of a weapon system is only a fraction of its true lifetime commercial value. The real money, the sustained, recurring, high-margin revenue, comes from the decades of maintenance, repair, overhaul, spare parts, software upgrades, crew training, and technical support that follow the initial sale. This aggregate is called sustainment, and it typically represents approximately 70% of a weapon system's total lifetime cost. For a fleet of fighter jets with a 30-year operational life, or a missile defense battery that operates for 25 years, sustainment dwarfs the purchase price. Saudi Arabia has explicitly designed its industrial strategy to capture that sustainment revenue at home. Every maintenance facility built inside the kingdom is a facility that will absorb repair contracts for decades. Every Saudi technician trained to service a Patriot battery is a technician whose labor fees will stay in the Saudi economy rather than being billed by an American contractor. Every local supply chain developed through the Industrial Participation Program is a supply chain that keeps spending circulating inside Saudi Arabia. The initial purchase crosses the Atlantic. The lifetime revenue increasingly does not. Saudi Arabia is simultaneously building leverage through supplier diversification that makes its negotiating position with America structurally stronger every year. It has active defense relationships with France, whose Rafale jet competes directly with American aircraft for Saudi contracts, with Italy's Leonardo, with Turkey's Baykar drone company, which has signed agreements to supply and potentially co-develop unmanned aerial vehicle technology inside Saudi Arabia, with South Korea, with India, with Pakistan, with multiple other nations. Each new supplier relationship is not simply a source of hardware or technology. It is a credible alternative that Saudi Arabia can wave at any American company or American government official who tries to negotiate on terms Riyadh does not accept. The side with genuine alternatives always holds the real power in any negotiation. Saudi Arabia has spent the last decade methodically ensuring it always has them. There is a legal dimension here that deserves attention because it affects how this relationship works in practice at the level of daily business operations. The International Traffic in Arms Regulations, ITAR, governs how American companies can transfer military technology to foreign entities. Under ITAR, the compliance burden and the legal liability for any transfer rests entirely on the American company, not on the foreign recipient. The U.S. State Department's own guidance documents explicitly confirm this, as Saudi Arabia's localization requirements push American contractors to transfer more and more technology, more and more knowledge, more and more capability into Saudi hands. Every additional transfer is a new node of legal risk that the American company carries entirely on its own balance sheet. Saudi Arabia receives the technology. Saudi Arabia does not carry the legal risk that comes with it. If transferred knowledge ends up misused, mishandled, or subject to a compliance violation, it is the American company that faces prosecution, fines, and reputational damage. This asymmetry runs through the entire relationship. It is not accidental. It reflects who designed the system and who it was designed to benefit. Beyond legal risk, American companies are required to establish permanent regional headquarters inside Saudi Arabia as a condition of continued government business. By 2024, this requirement was being enforced across the industry. What this means in practice is that the most strategically sensitive companies in American industry, the companies that build the weapon systems that underpin American military power, are required to maintain physical, permanent, deeply embedded presences inside a foreign state. Saudi officials have continuous access to these operations. Saudi partners sit inside joint ventures with intimate knowledge of business strategies, pipeline decisions, technology roadmaps, and personnel. The knowledge leakage from this kind of structural proximity is not dramatic or sudden. It is continuous and cumulative, the way water finds its way through stone, not visibly from one moment to the next, but completely over time. The scenario that serious, long-term analysts think about is what this relationship looks like in 2033 or 2035. SAMI has continued climbing the global defense rankings. Localization is well past 50%. Saudi Arabia's industrial base is producing advanced systems, missile components, electronic warfare platforms, armored vehicles, drone technology, with genuine capability and at costs that reflect a domestic labor market, not an American one. Saudi Arabia then does what Vision 2030 explicitly intends. It begins to export. It competes for defense contracts in Pakistan, in Egypt, in Indonesia, in sub-Saharan Africa, in Southeast Asia. These are markets where price matters enormously, and where a capable regional defense manufacturer can offer technology that is built on an American foundation. Because American companies helped build that foundation under contractual obligation, at prices American companies cannot profitably match. The United States spent a century building the most dominant defense industrial base in human history. Saudi Arabia spent a decade figuring out how to use that base as a subsidized university, paying tuition in the form of weapons contracts, and graduating as a credible future rival. The specific countries where Saudi Arabia would compete for export contracts are worth naming because they represent a significant portion of the global defense market that American companies currently dominate. Egypt spends roughly $4 to $5 billion on defense imports annually and has historically bought heavily from the United States. Pakistan has defense needs that dwarf its budget and actively seeks affordable suppliers. Nigeria, Kenya, and other African nations are modernizing their militaries and cannot afford American prices for most major systems. Indonesia, Vietnam, and several other Southeast Asian nations are large military spenders with growing modernization programs. In all of these markets, the decisive factor is often not capability alone. It is the combination of adequate capability and affordable price. A Saudi defense industry that has absorbed American technology over 15 years of structured knowledge transfer, and that produces systems at costs, reflecting a Saudi labor market rather than a California or Texas one, would be genuinely competitive in every one of these markets. American companies would be competing against technology they helped create, sold at prices they cannot match, from a company that did not exist before 2017. That is the specific end state that Saudi Arabia's strategy, if executed as planned, is designed to produce. None of this is speculation. Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030 documents explicitly include defense exports as a strategic objective. SAMI's leadership has publicly described international sales as a development goal. The industrial infrastructure to pursue those exports is being built today, with American assistance, funded by American contract revenue. There is a version of this story that American officials and defense company executives tend to tell publicly, and it goes like this. The relationship with Saudi Arabia is a net win for America overall. The jobs it supports are real. The production lines it keeps funded are real. The revenue it generates flows back through the American economy in wages and taxes and supplier contracts. The $142 billion deal creates sustained employment for American workers in Alabama, in Texas, in Connecticut, and California. All of that is true, and none of it should be dismissed or minimized. The near-term benefits of this relationship are genuine, and they matter to real people in real communities who depend on defense industry employment. But the architecture of what Saudi Arabia has built over the last decade is not designed to deliver its most important effects in the near term. The localization framework, the industrial participation program, the domestic industrial base that has already reached 25% of total spending, the supplier diversification strategy that spans 4 continents, the sustainment capture program embedded in every major contract, the mandatory headquarters relocations, the ITAR liability asymmetry, all of it is designed to compound over 10 to 20 years and deliver its full effect gradually. And by every measurable indicator, it is running ahead of its own ambitious schedule. What makes this particularly difficult for American policy to address is that the mechanism Saudi Arabia is using is entirely legal, entirely transparent, and entirely consistent with normal commercial negotiation. Saudi Arabia is not breaking any rules. It is not cheating. It is simply being a more strategically sophisticated buyer than its suppliers expected. The implications for Middle Eastern conflicts, Korean Peninsula stability, and global security are profound. Ukraine is demonstrating that military power increasingly depends not on size or budget, but on innovation, adaptability, and willingness to take risks. Small nations can contest great powers if they're smart enough, creative enough, ruthless enough. For Ukraine, this is existential. Every flamingo hitting a Russian missile factory is one step closer to survival. Every bomber destroyed at Engels is dozens of missiles that won't hit Kyiv. Every air defense battery disabled is clearer skies for Ukrainian aircraft. Ukraine fights not for empire or ideology, but for existence. That motivation produces innovations that peacetime militaries would never attempt. That motivation justifies risks that cautious planners would never accept. That motivation sustains effort that comfortable societies would never match. Today is Saturday, February 22nd, 2026. 48 hours ago, a Ukrainian cruise missile flew 1,300 kilometers through Russian air defenses and destroyed a critical missile production workshop. 8 months ago, 117 Ukrainian drones struck 5 Russian air bases simultaneously from inside Russia, destroying $7 billion of irreplaceable bombers. Throughout 2025, Ukrainian operators destroyed $5 billion of Russian aircraft and air defense systems, using weapons costing a tiny fraction of that amount. Russia started this war believing its strategic depth, its vast geography, would protect it. That assumption is dead. Ukraine has demonstrated consistent ability to strike anywhere in European Russia. To hit targets Moscow considered absolutely secure. To destroy assets Russia cannot replace. The strategic bombers burning at Olenka, the missile factory burning at Votkinsk, the air defense systems destroyed across Russia, these are not isolated incidents. They are systematic degradation of Russian military power achieved through innovation, asymmetry, and relentless exploitation of vulnerability. Moscow cannot stop it, cannot protect everything, cannot rebuild fast enough. The initiative has shifted. Ukraine dictates the tempo, Ukraine chooses the targets. Ukraine demonstrates daily that Russia's military, despite its size and nuclear arsenal, is not invincible. That determination and creativity can overcome conventional superiority. That the side fighting for survival will out-innovate, out-adapt, outlast the side fighting for conquest. The Flamingo missiles are just beginning production. The drone operations are accelerating. The strikes on Russian strategic assets will intensify throughout 2026. And every strike reminds Moscow that this war is not going according to plan. That Ukraine will not surrender. That every month this conflict continues costs Russia more than it can afford. That the weapons factories, air bases, and production facilities Putin assumed were safe are now legitimate targets being hit with increasing frequency and devastating effectiveness. Russia believed distance would protect it. Ukraine just proved that assumption catastrophically wrong. The strike on Votkinsk, coming 1,300 kilometers deep into Russian territory, destroying a facility producing the missiles Russia uses to terrorize Ukrainian cities, represents not just tactical success, but strategic transformation. The untouchable air bases, the secure production facilities, the protected strategic assets, none of them are safe anymore. Ukraine can reach them. Ukraine is reaching them, and Ukraine is destroying them. The war continues, but the balance is shifting. And that shift began not in boardrooms or parliament chambers, but in workshops, where Ukrainian engineers developed cruise missiles in 9 months, in operations rooms where Ukrainian intelligence mapped Russian air defenses and found the gaps, in trucks driven into Siberia, carrying drones that would destroy bombers worth hundreds of millions, and the audacity to attempt what conventional military wisdom said was impossible. Russia invaded Ukraine believing this would be quick. Kyiv would fall in days. The government would collapse. The military would surrender. 24 months later, Ukraine stands. 24 months later, Ukraine is not just defending, but striking back, hitting targets 1,500 kilometers inside Russia, destroying irreplaceable strategic bombers, shutting down missile factories, systematically degrading the military machine Putin built over 2 decades. The Votkinsk strike that happened 48 hours ago will not end this war, but it represents something perhaps more important than any single battle. It represents Ukraine's refusal to accept the role of victim. It represents Ukrainian determination to take the fight to Russia itself. It represents a small nation telling a nuclear superpower, you can invade us, but you will pay for it every single day in ways you never imagined. In bombers burning at Arctic air bases, in cruise missiles punching through factory roofs, in the systematic destruction of everything you need to sustain this war. Moscow is learning what imperial powers throughout history have learned, that occupied nations fight back, that determination cannot be bombed into submission, that every act of aggression breeds resistance, and that sometimes the smaller power wins, not because it is stronger, but because it refuses to lose.